The French Quarter, New Orleans. It's possibly the greatest collection of beautiful structures within such a small space in America. And yet, from within the walls of one of the most arguably bland buildings in the quarter, occurred one of the most brutal murders in the history of the city. Nestled on Ursuline Street, between Bourbon and Royale, this typical yet nondescript building was once the home of Henry and Teresa Moiti. They lived in the second-floor apartment. To most living in the area, the Moitis were just another family on the block. This was until the morning of October 27th, 1927. Nettie Compass, a cleaning woman for the family, arrived and entered the apartment. All was quiet, but almost as quickly as she entered, Nettie noticed blood spatter there. She fled, looking for help, getting the attention of two insurance men in the area. Assisting Nettie, the two men searched the apartment, discovering a bed mattress soaked in blood. Something terrible had happened. As the search continued, the men stumbled onto two traveling trunks, noticing they'd been surrounded by discarded clothing, as though they'd recently and erratically been removed from the trunks. Curious, they cracked them both open to discover a sight beyond gruesome. The bodies of two women, hacked into pieces to fit them more easily into the trunks. Both women showed signs of suffering blunt force trauma from a club of some kind. Their heads, arms, and legs had been hacked off, reportedly with a machete. It was truly a chaotic, bloody act of madness. But by who? And who were these women? Considering the location of the discovery, it didn't take long to discover that one of the women was Teresa Moiti. The other body was identified as her sister-in-law, Leniency Moiti. But still, who was their killer? It could have been Henry, or his brother Joseph, Leonide's husband. But why would one kill his brother's wife as well as his own? It certainly wasn't a common murder, but on the outset, Joseph Moiti immediately came forward, expressing the belief that his brother, Henry, was the killer. To his case, it appeared Henry, on the other hand, had gone on the run. But none of this was definitive evidence of a murderer. Where was the evidence? A cab driver, Evan Morgan, came forward and stated that around 2 a.m. on October 27th, only hours before this double murder was discovered, he had driven Henry Moiti to that apartment. He also stated that he helped Henry remove his children from the apartment at that time. He did not see any evidence of a murder happening at that time, but why was Henry removing his children in the middle of the night? The search was on, with many assuming if Henry was guilty, that he had likely got off somewhere and taken his own life. But until he was found, the search was on, and with New Orleans being surrounded by various waterways, one thing police called for was for any boat operators to look out for Henry. It was a good thing they did. On October 30th, 3 days after the murder, a man matching Henry's appearance and acting in a desperate manner was seen to beg his way onto a ship. He was quickly reported, and finally apprehended. Now the story could finally come out. As one would expect, Henry had a pretty unbelievable explanation for what had happened. He'd met a man named Gene Erickson, someone he described as a deranged sailor. He then began discussing feelings that his wife had been unfaithful to him, to which Erickson said if Teresa were his wife, he'd have killed her. And that's just what he did. Henry admitted to buying the blade used in the killing and could provide no explanation as to how Erickson ended up with it. After butchering Teresa and then Leonide, for whatever reason, Erickson then forced Henry and Joseph to place the bodies in these trunks. It only took till the following day for Henry to recant this story. This allowed authorities to get to the heart of what happened and why. Henry had already admitted to his despondence over his wife's infidelity, and when Joseph came forward, days before Henry was caught, he said he believed Henry had killed them in relation to Teresa being unfaithful to him. Henry cleared the air, telling, quote, his truth. He'd been suspicious of his wife's fidelity for a long time, and had recently become convinced she was having an affair with their landlord, likely with no evidence. Unfortunately, when one allows their suspicions to take shape, building and eventually overwhelming them, having proof ceases to matter. Suspicions have become fact, and by the evening of October 26, 1927, it seems Henry had reached that point. In an almost trance-like state, Henry wandered around the quarter, got drunk, and put a plan into motion. When he'd left home, Teresa and Leonide had just arrived, and his last-ditch effort to convince his wife to be faithful fell on deaf ears. He was going to kill them both, as he felt Leonide shared responsibility for Teresa's adulterous behavior. He already knew what he was going to do long before he went home. And when he arrived, he waited and waited till the two women went to bed. He then butchered his wife in their own bed. To represent how truly disassociated he must have become from the depravity he'd engaged in, he described the killing almost as though he did not control it himself. He was quoted to say that, as he stood over his wife, that the knife simply descended into her body, and suddenly she was dead. Without a moment's hesitation, Henry stormed into another bedroom, blood dripping from his blade. He did the same to Leonide as he had just done to his own wife. While the killing likely happened during a disassociated state of madness, authorities still noted how skilled Henry had been with his blade. Turns out, he'd previously worked as a butcher in a meat shop. He'd also already planned on putting them into the trunks, which he would then throw into the Mississippi River. This form of getting rid of murder victims was fairly common back in the early 20th century, which is odd, since it was practically never effective. But for whatever reason, Henry never quite made it to that point. He just went on the run and left the trunks in the apartment. What was somewhat chilling was the fact that after Henry was apprehended, he was reunited with his brother Joseph, who bore barely any ill will towards him. Joseph certainly was critical under the circumstances, but very passive as far as I'm concerned. Maybe it was just a brother thing, but still, this guy had just butchered his wife. Brother or not, it was bizarre that Joseph was so forgiving. Or maybe it wasn't. In the aftermath of Leonide Moity's death, a somewhat autobiographical written piece, which may have been little more than a journal or a diary, was found amongst her possessions, revealing that she was fairly despondent in her marriage as well. In this, she expressed that she'd once been happy in her marriage, but now considered it little more than a failure. Sadly, considering the time that this took place, many people use this diary to critique Leonide's morals as well as her status as a mother. Victim blaming 101. The implication was quite clear that both wives had, at least presumably, been unfaithful to their husbands. While Henry never implicated his brother, which likely wouldn't have helped his situation much, I almost wonder if Joseph did have some involvement in this double murder. While there appears to be no evidence putting him there, he was also having fidelity issues with his wife, and again, I find it truly outlandish how passive and forgiving he was to his brother, almost like he didn't care that his wife, and the mother of his children, was now gone. When Henry went on the lam, did Joseph see a chance to cover himself by quickly coming out and accusing his brother? Maybe. But then again, I may just be looking too hard for something that's just not there. Joseph went free, and Henry went on trial in March 1928 for the murder of his wife, in which the jury took only 27 minutes before coming back with a guilty verdict. Then, in April, he was convicted in the murder of Leonide. This unstable and deranged monster was off the streets and going away to prison for life. At least, that's what should have happened. The rest of this story is, well, another tragic example of what happens when clearly demented people who should be locked away are given shockingly too much leniency. In prison, Henry Moiety was considered a model prisoner to the point that he was allowed to go on work assignments that allowed him to leave the prison. In 1944, he managed to escape rather easily while on assignment, catching a taxi and ultimately traveling north to Chicago. Despite being an escaped murderer, authorities, who knew he was in Chicago, didn't even try going after him. They were literally of the attitude that Henry was responsible enough that he'd come back on his own. No surprise, that didn't happen. He remained free until 1946, when he was apprehended in St. Louis and finally returned to Louisiana. And even then, he was paroled 2 years later. After his parole, Henry moved to California and started a new life, a new environment, a second chance, and he met a girl named Alberta Orange and managed to fall in love again. Henry Moiety seemed to have actually reformed himself. And then in 1956, he tried to shoot her to death. Alberta managed to survive a gunshot wound to the chest, and Henry was off to prison again. Despite trying to kill yet another partner, he was given a, and I'm not kidding, 5-year prison sentence. Somehow, Henry had been slapped on the wrist again, and by the dawn of the 60s, could have been out on the streets again. But alas, he suffered a stroke and died in prison in 1957. But even with Henry Moiety long gone, in a way, his story lives on, in the ghostly lore that encapsulates New Orleans' French Quarter. It's the horror story of the sausage ghost of Ursuline Street. At least, that's the name I saw for it. In the story, a German couple, Mr. and Mrs. Hans Muller, ran a sausage factory on the ground floor of 725 Ursuline Street. This thin red building stands only 3 doors down from where the trunk murders happened. As the story goes, Hans went mad, murdered his wife and made sausage of her body, which he served to his customers. That was until one customer took a bite and found Miss Muller's wedding ring in their sausage. Her ghost then haunted the building, slowly driving her husband insane. It's a pretty messed up story, but definitely with connections to the 1927 trunk murders, even down to the fact that Henry was once a butcher. He'd also reportedly made a threat against his landlord, whom, again, he felt his wife was sleeping with, saying that if he ever got his hands on him, he'd cut him up to the point that he'd look like he'd been run through a sausage mill. Certainly, the tragic murders of two women should not be minimized by the existence of this sausage-centric creepypasta. But at the same time, this is a New Orleans story, and a French Quarter story at that. Every place has its hauntings and ghost stories. It comes with the culture. In the end, we have what is, on the surface, another story about a man who became homicidal through jealousy. A story that, tragically, has been told many times. But most of those stories boil down to one quick act. A couple seconds and it's over. But Henry Moidy was a man driven to such madness. A madness that had likely always been a part of him, just hiding beneath the surface. That a quick, simple murder wasn't enough. I honestly don't know if I believe that he intended on using the trunks so he could throw the bodies in the river. I think the trunks were a ruse, an excuse for him to escalate his brutality to another level by, quote, having to dismember his victims. And that's when a story goes from dark to grotesque.